Assalamu alaikum. We will begin with lecture 27 today, and we shall look at the last poem by William Butler Yeats in your course, and that is called The Second Coming. Now, before we discuss this poem, let us just recap what we did in the last lecture. In the last lecture, we studied another complex and highly symbolic poem of Yeats, and that was with the title Sailing to Byzantium. And I'm sure you recall that the poem employed lots of complex images, but the complexity of the poem was more due to the mystical, the mythical, in fact the mythical concepts of Yeats. It was how he describes his historical view, or the cyclical view of life, or the cyclical view of civilizations, or the cyclical view of existence, which we find in many religions around the world. It was this view of or the cyclical nature of life that Yeats was so fond of, that gives the poem its central theme. And we saw how this cyclic nature that Yeats employs in the poem, how it is linked to his idea of a gyre, how it is linked to that expanding the gyre that I showed you in the brief diagram that I made for you in that previous lecture, how that it starts from one single point and it revolving in the circular motion, how the gyre or the spiral expands and the circle widens and widens and widens, and when it reaches its maximum width, then according to Yeats, it just doesn't evaporates or is destroyed. He says, but from that maximum limit, another life begins. So the spiral, the gyre begins again. From that extreme point, a new life begins, and then the same circle happens. So it was this concept which was inherent in the other poem, and which we shall see is inherent in today's in the poem that we are going to discuss today as well. And you shall see that this cyclical nature of history and this cyclical nature of civilizations is an important theme with Yeats, and with this theme are linked and connected are other sub-themes in the poems. So The Second Coming, as the title of the poem suggests, it is about the second coming of the Messiah. It is about the second coming of Jesus Christ. But we shall see that the poem is complex, because for Yeats it does not only offer the Christian or the religious interpretation, it has the mythical interpretation also. It can have some other interpretations as well. So the poem is once again complex, and there are lots of symbols that are used in the poem. There are lots of images that are used in the poem that add to the complexity of the poem. But primarily, as the word shows, Yeats was writing, we know, in the 20th century, and 2000 centuries had passed before since the birth of Jesus Christ. And there was this prophecy that after these 2000 years, one cycle is complete. So when you say one cycle, Yeats is imagining his spiral, he's imagining his gyre, he's imagining that gyre where life moves in the circular motion. It expands and expands, it moves away from its roots, it moves away and away and away. And as it moves further away from its root, it loses its touch completely with its roots. And when that happens, it breaks away. Everything turns loose, and there is destruction, there is anarchy, there is confusion. And when that stage is reached by any civilization, Yeats tells us that is the time for another rebirth. That is the time for another cycle to begin. So another cycle of spiral, another gyre begins to take shape, and then a new journey and the new civilization is born. So this is how he views it. And so he says the time, the 20th century, this time is ripe for this change. Now, change for the good or for the worse, that is what we shall see is the main theme of this poem. But although the poem is not very long, although the poem you shall see consists only of a few lines, and the division of stanzas is rough and loose, and there are just 2 stanzas of differing lines but we shall see that the thematic value of the poem is high, the symbolic worth is great, and the interpretation is varied, and that is why it is one of the most highly regarded poems of Yeats till this time, till the present time. And a lot of criticism and a lot of critics have given their interpretation of the poem. But maybe we have to understand that Yeats maybe deliberately kept the true meaning of the poem hidden from his readers or his audience. He did not offer any comments on which version did he believe to be true. So we shall see that the poem offers a multitude of interpretations, and it involves Yeats's concepts of his own concept of the cyclic nature of history and the continuation of life through that way, and it also involves the Christian view of the second coming of Jesus Christ, or the Messiah, the Savior, who is going to save this world. Or at the same time, it's also related to the coming of an Antichrist, because that's also, it's not just a myth, it's also part of the religion, that before Christ, the Antichrist will emerge, and the Antichrist will lead the world towards complete destruction before it is the order is brought back by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So let us look at the poem, and let us see how you evolve an understanding of the poem. So once again, so before we look at the text of the poem, we shall we shall find out something about the poem. Now, the Second Coming was written in 1919 in the aftermath of the First World War, and this should explain to you why Yeats presents such a disturbing image of the world, because he had just witnessed the horrors of the First World War. He had just seen how the World War had brought destruction to most of the major cities, to most of the major European cities. So he was naturally disappointed. He was naturally disillusioned. He naturally saw that the end of the world was near. He saw destruction all around him, and he felt maybe that this civilization has reached its ultimate limit. As he explains through his concept of the gyre or the spiral, like I explained to you in the last lecture, that when the gyre reaches its ultimate limit, when it is away from its roots and it reaches the ultimate limit, there is chaos and confusion. But then he says life doesn't stop there or end there. A new life begins from that same point. So he is going to show how when a complete destruction is reached, the new life, either for good or for worse, will emerge from that debris, from that destruction. And this version of the poem that we have included in the text, in the course, is as it was published in the edition of Michael Roberts and the Dancer, dated 1920. The reason I mention this is because there are numerous other versions of the poem which are also available. The preface and notes in the book contain some philosophy which is also attributed to Roberts. So the poem is a significant poem. The second coming, it refers to Christians' philosophy in the Bible book of Revelation, that Jesus Christ will return to defeat the Antichrist, overthrow evil, and then establish his 1,000-year reign. This is a prophecy that is made in the Christian Bible, in the book of Revelation, that is one chapter of the Bible. And according to that prophecies, Jesus Christ will return, but he will defeat the Antichrist. So there has to be this Antichrist. Most of the people saw Hitler in those times as the Antichrist. So they were naturally waiting for the coming of the Jesus Christ now to establish his reign, which would bring peace and harmony in the world. So Jesus Christ, according to the prophecy, will return, will defeat the Antichrist, will overthrow his evil rule, and will establish his own 1,000 years of reign. But as we shall see that in the poem, Yeats incorporates his own view of history and future through the image of the gyres, cone-shaped spirals that intersect so that each gyre's narrowest point is contained inside the widest part of the other. I am not going to draw it again because I drew the image, the same image for you in the previous lecture. So he gives his own view of history and future, and through this image of gyre. So, and the gyre is actually the cone-shaped spiral. They are in the conical shape, in the shape of a cone, which is narrow from the bottom, and then as it goes up, it spreads. So it is like a triangle, but it is cone shaped. But he says these they intersect. They're interdependent. They meet, so that each gyre's narrowest point is contained in the widest, inside the widest part of the other. So there is this one gyre which starts on the narrowest point. It spreads out as it reaches its widest part. The next gyre intersects. It starts exactly from that widest part, and the cone is formed again. The spiral is formed again, and then the other gyre would again begin from the widest part of that gyre, and another gyre would start. So this is his cyclic view of history, and this is his view of future. This is how he says civilizations have come and gone. When you look at the history of the world, civilizations, that is how civilizations took birth. One civilization started from one point, reached its height. When it reached its height, it started to crumble. But from that crumbling point, he says the seeds of another empire, of another civilization are sown. And from that destruction emerges another empire. And another empire builds, and then it reaches a point where there's again confusion and chaos. And when it reaches that point, the seeds of another empire, another civilization are sown, and then another takes birth. So this is the cyclic view of nature. We know that in the Western history, there was this Greek empire, which is replaced by, which reaches its height of power, and at the height of power it starts to disintegrate, and then is replaced by the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was a magnificent empire. It ruled for centuries, but then it also crumbled, and then out of the Roman Empire came these powerful countries that we now know, France and England and Italy and other European countries. So the same is the case everywhere. We see how in our own Islamic history there are the Umayyads who replaced by Abbasids, and Abbasids replaced by Umayyads, and so the empires are then later on replaced by Fatimids from Egypt, which are then replaced by the Seljuks. And then there are the Mongols, so who are replacing the other at the height of their power. So when they're furthest away from their origin, that is when the one civilization ends and the other starts to take over. So we shall see that in this poem, apart from the biblical Christian interpretation, this view of history, Yeats's view of history, is also important. Now, the gyres represent different elemental forces in the historical cycles, or different stages in the development of human psyche. These gyres, these spirals, you see the spiral has different, a spiral has a body, but it has a body which is, separate. There are separate rings, they're separate rings. So it says each ring represents different forces in the history. So there are stages. The closest one is the one that is closest to the starting point, that's purer, and the next ring is pure also, then pure. Then as you move away from the closest point, those rings become corrupted and polluted and corrupted and polluted, and the last one is extreme corruption and extreme pollution. So these rings in the spiral or in the gyre, they also represent the different stages in the development of human psyche, or different stages in the development of the human civilization. So we were talking about the gyres, and we see that each gyre, it begins in the purity of concentrated point and it degenerates into chaos. In his own book, Yeats describes the gyres as intersecting cones, one widening out while the other focuses in to a single point. And the passage between the gyres is a transition to a new world and not the end of the world. And it is this description of the gyres that shows how there is continuity, how there is a transformation in history, how civilizations do not come to an abrupt end and the new beginning is made from nowhere. Yeats tells us, and it is his belief, that the birth, the seeds of the new birth, they are sown at the point of that extreme chaos or extreme confusion or extreme destruction, or which he describes as the widening point of the gyre. You can understand this concept of the gyre through this image that I'm going to show to you, but keep this line in mind when he says he describes the gyres as intersecting cones, the two cones that intersect each other, that meet, and one widening out while the other focuses in to a single point. And how is that achieved? You can see it in this image here. You can see in the image that there are two cones, and the two cones are intersecting at each point. As you see, one cone is intersecting with the other cone here. This cone, this is a starting point of this cone. This is a center point of this cone, as we describe it. And this is a starting point, and it is the point of birth of a civilization. And according to Yeats' belief, from this center point, from this starting point, or from this point of center, the civilization then starts to expand. And he gives you the image of the spiral, which I also created for you in the previous lecture. But it is the spiral. You can imagine it moving in the circle, and you can imagine each ring developing and widening and widening. And when it reaches its maximum point, as Yeats describes us here, you see this is a maximum point. This line here, it describes the maximum limit that is reached by the civilization. And he says when this maximum limit is reached, what happens? This maximum limit. So this is the maximum limit. And when this is reached, he says, this is a point of utter confusion and chaos in the civilization. This is a time when the civilization is so far removed from its central beliefs and philosophies that it has forgotten its ways. It has gotten lost, and it is a time for it to be destroyed. It is time for it to be completely eliminated and be replaced by another one in its place. But the important philosophy that I'm trying to explain to you here is the intersection or the meeting of these cones. Yeats believed that these civilizations, they meet, they intersect each other. So the end point of one is the beginning point of the other, and the beginning point of the other is the end point of some other civilization. And it is in this way that civilizations change over time or are replaced by other civilizations in history. And this was a phenomena of history, and it was a phenomenon of the European history also. As you know that the great Greek civilization in the Western history was replaced later on by the Roman civilization, and then the Romans civilization integrated and broke down, and there was chaos and confusion. But out of the Roman civilization then arose this Western empire, having autonomous, powerful countries. So now we have these powerful countries, but then he says within those countries every civilization will have its end. So Yeats here is referring to that end, and if you see the starting point as from the Christian point of view as the point of birth of Jesus Christ, so if you see it as that, if you see it as the birth of Christ, if you see it as a birth of Christianity, you see the Yeats then tells you that 20 centuries have passed, that 20,000 years have passed. He says 20 centuries have gone by, so he expects another revelation, he expects a change now, and he expects this century, this civilization to come to its close, because as a result of the World War there's complete destruction and utter confusion now. So he is, for him, it's like a cycle. It is a continuous process, and it is linked. One process is linked to the previous one, and they are not separate from each other. And this is how he has explained it himself in the book, and this is how I have even read out that explanation that he offers in the book. And this is why he says that the passage between the gyres is a transition to a new world, and it is not the end of the world. It's not the end of the previous world. It is not the complete end of the world. It is not the apocalypse, as we call it. It is not the judgment day, as we describe it, but he says that it is just a transition into a new world. So the world will enter into a new phase. The world will enter into a new world, but whether good or bad, we don't know. But there will be a transition. There will be a change. So we can deduce that the poem describes an apocalypse which is different from the Christian vision of the end of the world. The Christian, or even ours, the Muslims' view of the end of the world is that there will be a complete end of the world. There will be the nuclear wars, and the result will be the complete end of the world, and then the souls will be taken elsewhere. That is the religious view. But Yeats offers us a historical view where he says that there is not a complete ending, there's not the complete end of the world, there's not complete utter destruction. The destruction point, when it is reached, is at the beginning of the other point. So that is how he links the two concepts. And then the poem, we see that it starts with the image of the falcon wheeling about in the sky, far away from the falconer who released it. This is how he opens the poem. He creates for you the image of this falcon moving away from its point of control or authority, who is the falconer, its trainer. He releases the falconer, and he releases the falcon, and falcon then flies away from the falconer, spirals, circles above his head, and moves away from him, and so far away from him that it cannot even hear the voice of its trainer. And this metaphor stands for poet's belief that the world he knew was coming to an end. And this picture that image that he creates for us only describes his belief that this world or this civilization that they knew or they lived in was actually coming to an end. Let's look at stanza 1. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. So you see what he's saying? He says that he gives us the image of a falcon moving away and away from the falconer. the falconer who represents control. And he shows that his movement, the falcon's movement away from the falconer, it turns the whole world upside down. But he says turning and turning in a widening gyre. The falcon, when it moves above the head of the falconer, looking for its prey, it moves in a circular fashion. So he's describing the circular motion of that falcon. The falconer, the master, is standing underneath, is standing on the ground. The falcon, he loosens, and the falcon rears, and it rises high from his arm, and it moves and in a circle. He says he turns and turns in a widen, and his circle becomes widened. And as it widens, like a gyre, he says, and the falconer falcon eventually so far removed, far away from the falconer, that it cannot even hear its call. The falconer normally give out a sound in order to call back the falcon to them. But he says the falcon has flew so away from the falconer that it cannot even hear its voice, hear its sound. And when that it has reached so far away, look at the imagery that Yeats next conceives. He says things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. So he says this complete disaster, this apocalypse, this death, as if this is the end of the world, things fall apart. He says there is complete destruction, things fall apart. The phrase became so famous that it's also been taken as the title of a famous novelist, Chinua Achebe. The title of it has become a famous title of one of his novels, and it has become the title of so many other works also. And it's an oft-quoted phrase. So he says, as a result of this journey or movement away from the center, the world is now in chaos. Things have fallen apart. The center cannot hold. Nothing can hold the world together now, because it is so far removed from the center. The center here may represent Jesus Christ, Christianity, and its powers as it was in the beginning, but now the world has moved so far away from it that it cannot, it is far away from its influence. And he says mere anarchy is loose, confusion. Anarchy represents confusion. So he says mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. There is confusion everywhere. And remember, he may be talking about the confusion that was a result of the World War. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Now he gives us images of more chaos. He says there is more confusion, there is more turbulence, because he makes things look worse, and he gives us images of sea full of blood, an image of drowning. He says the blood-dimmed tide is loosed. He says the sea of blood is now loosed upon the world. He's talking about the war. He's talking about the casualties of the war. He may be talking about war, in fact. He may be talking about the casualties of the war. But he's talking about the killings that have taken place on the mass scale. That is why he talked about blood-dimmed tide. So he says the tides, the waves are in the sea, they are of blood, they are made of blood. They are not water, but they are blood. They have the bloody color. They are loosed upon the world. It means they are now all over the world. It is as if the end of the world has come. He's creating for us an image of, or he's maybe reminding to us the Christian view of the apocalypse that happened once in the time of Prophet Noah, when the whole world drowned as a result of continuous raining, and only a few survived. So he's using that same imagery. He's talking about the destruction worldwide. So he says everywhere. So this bloody tide, it is loosed. This killing and destruction is going around on a massive scale. And everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. And in this blood-dim tide, what is drowned, he says? The innocents are drowned. The innocents are drowning. The pure, the good ones are drowning. So, and that is his worry. He says the good ones are being killed. They are drowned in this blood-dimmed tide that is loosed. And then he says the best lack all conviction. Now in these times of confusion, he says the best amongst us, the intellectuals amongst us, our leaders, they also lack all conviction, all belief, all faith. They are full of doubts. Lacking conviction means being full of doubts. He says they are now full of doubts, while the worst or the evil ones, they are full of passionate intensity. They are full of passion. They are full of energy, because they are on a killing spree. They are creating chaos. They are creating confusion. So there is this intensity about their actions. He here pictures a society moving towards self-destruction and chaos. So he says purity and innocence have given way to wickedness and evilness. And you can even compare it to the present-day condition, when and which is a fact that when the best amongst us, the intellectuals amongst us, or are true heroes or leaders amongst us, when they are full of doubts or when they become weak, the evil and the worst ones, they become passionate. They take control of the things. In the same way as as we sometimes describe as this fundamentalist thought that is becoming taking a powerful shape in this world today. That is also the result of the good ones leaving, good ones lacking conviction, and the good ones doubting their own faith. So those who have this passionate intensity, those who have more energy, they become dominant, and their philosophy becomes dominant, and their extreme views dominate, and they lead the world towards destruction and not towards an actual peaceful civilization. So it is the same picture of anarchy that Yeats felt was like in his times, that we can also relate to in our own times, because in these times also, the world is full of destruction. There are wars going around. There are killings going around. There are killings without any reason. The innocent ones are dying. The evil and the wicked ones are reigning supreme. And individual views, individual philosophies are more important than the actual dogmas or the principles of religion or the moral values. So a similar kind of destruction that we see in our times was maybe something that Yeats saw in his times, and it troubled him. And he's giving us a picture of that kind of world. In the second stanza, which is a longer one, he takes us into another kind of an image. He says, surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming? Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of spiritus mundi troubles my sight, a waste of desert sand. In the very first line, he tells us that after he's described to us in the previous stanza the condition of the world, because of his idea of the spiral or the gyre, which he describes through the image of the falcon moving away from the falconer. He says, because we have moved far removed from the center, there is destruction and chaos in the world, and the wicked and the evil ones are dominant over the innocent and the good ones. After he gives us a description of that world, he comes to his actual point. He says, now at this stage, surely Shams, the revelation is at hand. The stress is on the word surely, it is repeated. He said some revelation is at hand. At this point, in this point of complete destruction and utter confusion and chaos, surely something must happen. A new revelation must come. Just like when every civilization moved away from center, from teachings of the God, God would send a revelation, a new revelation through another prophet. He says, surely at this time some revelation it had, some kind of revelation will come, definitely. And then he says, surely the second coming is at hand. So he's sure, he says, surely the second coming, that is the Messiah, or Jesus Christ, his coming is at hand. His coming is near. At hand means near. So keeping in view line with his concept of the gyre, the moving, circling gyre, this civilization, Yeats views that this civilization has come to its end. It has reached its ultimate point. This is why he's saying, surely some change is now going to happen. Something is going to happen. And he says, the second coming, but then he questions himself. He says, is that really true? Will it be a Messiah? Will it be the coming of a Savior? He says, hardly are those words out when a vast image out of spiritus mundi troubles my sight. Now, spiritus mundi is a Latin word for the wild spirit, or the spirit of the world. And Yeats's personal belief was that each human mind is linked to a single vast intelligence. And again, it is his idea of being interconnected. Everything is interconnected. So all human beings all over the world, he says, they have the single vast, they share the same intelligence, same vast universal intelligence. So when he talks about the spiritus mundi, he's talking about the spirit of the world. And he says, when he thinks about the second coming, he imagines the spirit of the world, this wild spirit of the world, as if it is telling us something. And a vision of a vast desert comes to his mind. He says, a waste of a desert land. He pictures a desert sand, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it wind shadows of the indignant desert birds. He says, he views with the words second coming, comes to his mind an image. And what is that image? He says it is an image of the spiritus mundi. But this time, the spiritus mundi takes the form of a Sphinx. Now, a Sphinx is it's a mythical creature. It has a history, and we will look at its history at the end of the poem. But it should suffice for now that it is a beast. It is a beast. A Sphinx is a beast which has got a body of a lion and the head of a man. It has got the body of a lion with its tail, but the head is that of a man. So it is called Sphinx in Greek myth. The head of the man representing intellect, the intellectual power, and the body representing the passion, the emotions of the beast. So he says, with the second coming comes to my mind the image of a beast lying about in this vast desert. So you see, this is how he interconnects the Christian and the biblical view or the message with his own version of history. So he's going to blend the two. He's going to mix up the two. So he's talking about the coming of the Christ, but then he imagines a beast. He says, with a beast with a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun. Now the simile is that this beast has a gaze which is blank. Blank and pitiless suggest no emotions. it suggests a heart made of stone, it suggests cruelty, it suggests wickedness. So he says it has a cruel, blank and pitiless gaze as the sun. It doesn't have the warmth. It doesn't have the warmth of emotions. It doesn't have pity. It is pitiless, and it is blank. It is cruel. So this beast, he says, that is a cruel beast, is moving its slow thighs, and it's not stationary. It is, he says, moving slowly, while all about it wind shadows of the indignant desert birds. Once again he uses the image of the desert birds, and this is again taken, this image is again taken from the book of Revelation in the Bible, where the lion has the predatory power and has a royal strength and authority, but he is pitiless and devoid of love. So in biblical, according to Bible, lion is shown as having power and having the strength, royal strength and authority, because he's a king of the jungle, but he's also at the same time pitiless and without any love or feelings of compassion. So it's the same image that he has taken. So but he shows him how pitiless he is, how devoid of love and compassion he is. So unlike the image of the Christ, this lion, this Sphinx in fact is. And then he conjures the images of these birds. He says there are, and we can see the shadows of the birds moving in circular motion above his head. So the desert birds, these are the vultures. These desert birds here that are described are the vultures, and we know that vultures prey at the dead bodies. So the image of, and if they are about this lion, it should give us a hint that this is this cruel, pitiless Sphinx. It is moving to bring about more destruction, to make more killings, and that is why the vultures also accompany him, spiraling round him, gyring round him. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born? Then he asks this question. Complex lines these are. He says the darkness drops again, meaning the vision drops from his eyes. Or maybe he means that he's referring to the chaos and the confusion, because darkness stands for no hope. Darkness suggests a lack of hope, lack of happiness, and it suggests confusion and chaos and destruction and killing and death. So he says all of that is in the world. But now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to a nightmare by a rocking cradle. He says, but now I know why this beast has now awakened from its deep sleep. He says, because he had a nightmare of a rocking cradle. The rocking cradle here represents the young Jesus Christ, who was born in a manger. So the rocking cradle is a reference to the young Jesus Christ. He says, for 20 centuries, this demon or this beast or this Sphinx, it had lain asleep in the desert, in the wide, vast desert. But if it has now awakened, he says, it has been awakened, it has been vexed out of his slumber, vexed, disturbed, out of his sleep by a nightmare. And he saw for him it was a nightmare because he saw the vision of Christ. So it has now awakened, and it is now awakened to bring about more destruction in the world. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. And what is Where is it going? It's what is its direction? He says this rough beast. Again, it is significant. Yeats does not call it by any compassionate name or by any respectful name. He's calling it a rough beast. So it cannot be the image of the Christ here. He says, what rough beast whose hour has now come around at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Bethlehem is the place of birth of Jesus Christ. And for the beast to be going towards the birth place of Jesus Christ is a significant thing. We believe that even in our own religion, we believe that the Jesus Christ will return to his city of births. And if I'm not wrong, in Christianity also they believe that the Jesus Christ will return to his own place of birth, and it would be there that he will face the Antichrist and kill it. So we see that this Antichrist, if this is the Antichrist, the rough beast as Yeats described him, it is slouching towards Bethlehem. It has had the vision of Christ. It had seen the rocking cradle in his dreams or nightmares, as it calls it. It is now slouching, moving slowly towards Bethlehem. But Yeats tells us not for anything else but to be born again, but for more power. But it is not a statement, as we see, it is a question. So he asks a question and he leaves the question open for interpretation. And that is why the poem has numerous interpretations. The analysis of the poem is also very serious in nature, and although I will leave to you to take up an interpretation and make up your mind as to how you are going to interpret the poem, but we are going to look at all of these different themes that emerge from the poem. Now the first point is that Yeats' mythology is not easy to understand. Yeats himself did not intend its full meaning to be immediately apparent to those unfamiliar with his thoughts. He could have made clear his points, but he intentionally does not. And as we have seen, his myth is not easy to understand. He believed in cyclic view of history, which is reflected in the recurrence and convergence of images as they become multiplied and enriched. So his view of cyclic view of history, it is reflected in the recurrence of events, that they are repeated. The cycle is repeated, but it is also reflected in the convergence of images, in what I described to you when he says that all humans share the same universal knowledge, when he talks of the spiritus mundi. So again he shows that all images, they are repeated over history, and as they're repeated they become multiplied and they're enriched. So for his source also, he is referring to multiple images, and they may be taken from any time or any period in the given history. The cyclical nature of Yeats' conception means that there will be another antithetical annunciation in the future. The second coming not of Christ, but of his antithetical opposite. This is one interpretation of the poem. So he says that there will be the point of chaos, and it is there that there is the antithetical, the Antichrist will emerge, bring about utter destruction and chaos. So the poem may reflect the second coming. The poem Second Coming may reflect the second coming of the Antichrist, because the Antichrist, just like the Savior is expected at the turn of every century, an antithetical opposite is also expected in every civilization, or at the turn of every century. So this is the cyclical nature of Yeats's conception. The poem has historical, biblical resonances, as we have seen, and it conveys a dismayed view of the world, and it talks about the future. This is just a summary of the poem. Puzzling images are presented. The Sphinx is juxtaposed with the two images of the birds. Okay? The Sphinx is juxtaposed with two images of birds. how we see in the first stanza, there is a broken image of falcon dissociating from its trainer of falconer. And broken, we say it because falcon breaks away from the falconer. It moves further away. It is dissociated from its trainer or the falconer. And the second stanza, there are the broken images of many birds flying around the Sphinx, which is the single whole image, just like the falconer is the center point, and the falconer represents the furthest point. In the same way, the Sphinx represents the single whole point, and the birds circling around over his head, they represent the broken images. So these broken images are juxtaposed with the image of the whole, and that is what gives beauty to the poem. Just a brief history that I told you in the very beginning. I would give you the history of the Sphinx. What are the different meanings of the Sphinx, and how this Sphinx evolved over centuries. Now, in the late 1800s, Yeats actually joined the Order of the Golden Dawn, which was an occult sect, where he began to experiment with magic. The Golden Dawn put emphasis not on obscure and untraceable Indian and Buddhist masters, but on the European mystical tradition, mainly the Kabbalah. Kabbalah is originally a Jewish tradition of interpreting their religious Bible, but later on Christians adapted it into their own religious system. And Yeats is basically inspired from the European mystical tradition, although I have given you comparisons from the Buddhist and the Indian practices, but his source, Yeats's main source, is the European mystical tradition. And he got that knowledge when he became part of this occult sect in Ireland with the name Order of the Golden Dawn. The Golden Dawn encouraged its members to undertake occult experiments to demonstrate their power over the material universe. So he learned the art of magic. He learned to do magic, and it was encouraged because, as it says here, to demonstrate their power over the material universe. Not normally and naturally we know that a magician or someone who wants to learn magic, he does it because he wants to have power over the material world. He wants to become all-powerful like the Almighty. So the main aim of magic or a magician is to have hold or power or control over the other beings or over the material world or the material universe. So there were these practices that Yeats himself in his life went through. And Yeats spoke of it later as a chief influence upon his thought. So he was so immersed in the activities of this sect that naturally they were going to leave a mark on his thoughts. Yeats saw a close relationship between enchantment in magic and in literature. So because he got so involved in magic and in experimenting with magical activities, he fused magic, again his idea of interconnection, intersection. So he doesn't separate magic from literature. He sees just like magic can give you control, just like magic can give you power, he says, so can literature give you control. Literature can give you power and enchantment. It can, through magic, you can enchant others, bring them under your control, bring them under your power. In the same way, he says, through literature, you can enchant people, you can bring them under your control, you can influence them with your own ideas. So this was his belief. Again, he experimented and met with immediate success. And this experimented, we're talking about his magical experimented. And what was the success? In his own words, he says, early in his acquaintance with Matthews, the leader of the Golden Dawn, the magician put the tantric symbol of fire against his forehead, and Yeats slowly perceived a huge titan rising from desert sands. He was greatly excited because this kind of vision seemed to him to confirm his beliefs in the supernatural. So Yeats had started experimenting with magic because he wanted to believe in the supernatural world. He wanted to believe the supernatural phenomenon. So when one of the leaders put this symbol of fire against his forehead, Yeats imagined this huge beast rising from the desert sands. And naturally that got him excited. And soon he was experimenting upon all his friends and acquaintances, sometimes with remarkable success. And soon he would repeat this experiment with his other friends, and they would also imagine similar things. So you can see how involved he was with magic and its effects. And so this poem can be read under that backdrop also. And you can see how that same influence or the same kind of trance that he was under, the effects of magic, we see in the poem also. When he talks about the Sphinx, when he utters the word second coming, he imagines a Sphinx. He imagines a supernatural creature. He imagines a beast. He imagines a creature out of this world. So this is Yeats under the influence of this occult, the Golden Dawn. And the Sphinx actually in this cult, the Golden Dawn, it was regarded as a combination of elemental forces of fire and air. So this group, this cult, it saw the Sphinx, this beast, as a combination of the two elemental forces of fire and air, or representing or combining Leo, the lion, and the Aquarius, or the human. So having both the qualities of the lion or that of the human. In the introduction to the Resurrection, which is a short prose play and depicts this discussion among three men, one is a Greek, the other is a Hebrew, the other is a Syrian, who are among the first to meet the resurrected Christ. In that play, Yeats noted, he said, "I began to imagine, as always at my left side, just out of range of sight, a brazen winged beast, which I associated with laughing, ecstatic destruction." And further saying, the beast was afterwards described in my poem, The Second Coming. So you see, he was so involved in magic that he says that he always felt the presence of a beast. He felt the presence of a beast with having wings, he says, which he associated with destruction. And he says, I always felt its presence near my left shoulder. He says he describes the same beast in The Second Coming. So this is the beast of destruction. In another poem, The Double Vision of Michael Roberts, he takes on a Greek female form. So this Sphinx becomes a Greek Sphinx, a Sphinx with a woman breast and the lion paws. In Greek myth, the Sphinx is a female, as opposed to the Egyptian myth, where it is a male. The image of the cat also suggests a great independent spirit and a heretic leader in Egypt who lived at about 1350 BC and was called the heretic pharaoh named Akhenaton. This is just another link for you, because the Sphinx was also famous with the Egyptians, and we have this image of Sphinx on many of these graves that we call them of the Egyptian kings. The Sphinx with the head of the man and the body of the lion is represented on most of the tombs in Egypt. And it was considered holy. It was considered a guardian spirit, in fact, and that was why the Egyptians, in fact, even revered the Sphinx. But this image of Sphinx that Yeats has used here, it is more of a destructive kind, which was under the influence of those magical experiments that he was doing himself, and which he himself says that as it is described in his poem, The Second Coming, it is a destructive image that he often felt near him also. So I have given you a comprehensive description of the Sphinx and of the various ideas, or of the various concepts that have emerged from the poem. You can form your own opinion, but from the most common and the prevalent ideas, we can conclude that this poem, The Second Coming, refers to the biblical second coming of Jesus Christ. But Yeats, like it is, like it should be expected of him, in the middle, when he's introducing to us the second coming of Jesus Christ, he somehow loses that vision of hope. He feels that there's more destruction to come. So he conjures, or he creates an image of an antichrist, of an antithetical opposite to Christ, who will bring about further destruction. And maybe after that we can prophesy the coming of the second coming of the Jesus Christ. So what is this image? I leave it up to you. You can say that he's talking about the second coming of Jesus Christ, but you can see, as he describes the beast, as he describes his cruel, pitiless nature and gaze, as he even uses the words for that beast, calling it the rough beast, we cannot associate it with Jesus Christ. We cannot associate him with the holy figure and sacred figure of Jesus Christ. So he seems to be talking about a mythical creature, and he's talking about this mythical creature that is a result of his magic. But let us not confuse that magic here in the poem. In the poem, we can say that he's leading us to the rise of an antichrist. Like, we also believe that before the Messiah comes, there will be what we call, not call as antichrist, but we call as the one-eyed, evil, wicked man. So he will come, rule the world, and bring about destruction. Then the last Imam Mahdi, will come, and he will kill it and destroy it. So we have also got those interpretations in our religion. So maybe this is the coming of that Antichrist, the antithetical opposite to Christ, which Yeats is envisioning in the poem. So I leave it to you to form your own opinion of the poem after you have given it a thorough reading later on. With this, I come to the end of the lecture. In the next lecture, I will describe to you another poet and some other works of the poet. So I take leave from the lecture today, and I shall meet you again in the next lecture. Thank you.